we have another remote presentation from Eli Scott with the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, affectionately known as RB1, depending on who you're talking to. But he's going to talk a little about regulations for water quality in the Scott and Shasta River watershed. So thank you, Eli.
Yeah, I'm going to request to share. And while that's happening, I wish I were there, but I'm doing the really important work.
There we go.
Yeah, got it? Cool. Doing the really important work is calibrating DO loggers to be deployed next week in Scott. So that's why I couldn't be there in person. But yeah, so I will take it away. Let me get all my screens set up here. Cool, that should be it. So as is my habit, there's more information in here than I have time to go over. So bear with me, I'm going to talk real fast. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about the past and present regulations that have been in place on agriculture in the Scott and Shasta watersheds, which you can see on this slide right here. We've been talking about the Shasta a bunch and the Scott a little bit. I'm going to be reviewing the past program that we've been utilizing to regulate water quality, as well as the development of the future orders, some of the concepts that are in there, and our timeline for adoption. Being the second to last presentation, talking about regulation is always the most exciting way to end the day out. So just to give you all some history on the Scott and Shasta, they're both impaired for different water quality constituents. The Scott is impaired for sediment and temperature, and then also biostimulatory conditions. The timelines of those impairments are on the screen. You can see those for yourself. We adopted TMDLs for sediment and temperature back in 2005, and those were approved by the EPA in 2006. The Shasta is impaired for temperature and dissolved oxygen, and we developed TMDLs for that in 2006, which were adopted by the EPA in 2007. Water quality, as it relates to agriculture, has sort of been a slow journey for the state of California. Back in 2001, agriculture, which actually was exempt from water quality regulations, came into the fold of all the different discharges of waste that had to be regulated. So in 2001, we ended our agricultural exemption to what's called waste discharge requirements, which is just a fancy way to say a permit to discharge waste into water bodies and waters of the state. Like I said, 2006, we got the temperature and sediment TMDLs approved in the Scott. We also developed what was called our first Scott waiver. And so I mentioned waste discharge requirements. There's also another kind of permit called a waiver of waste discharge requirements, which doesn't waive the need to have a permit. It waives a process around reporting your waste of discharge. Basically, it's a way of saying, we know what the discharges are for this set of activities, and so we're going to set conditions on those discharges in order to permit it. So we adopted that. It's really common in the agricultural world to have waivers of waste discharge requirements instead of actual waste discharge requirements. Very technical, bureaucratic thing, but I think it's important to point that out. In 2007, the TMDLs for temperature and DO in the Shasta were adopted, and we also got our first Shasta waiver in place back then. In 2010, we initiated a regional agricultural land discharge program and formed a stakeholder advisory group to talk about what that would look like in the North Coast and kind of set the stage for building up to what is now our current development and implementation of our irrigated lands regulatory program. In 2012, we updated the Scott and Shasta waivers. They have to be updated every 5 years, which is a big staff effort. And then we did that again in 2018, about more or less 5 years later. There was a fire in Santa Rosa in 2017, so it was a little bit delayed to do that. And then 2023, we renewed the 2018 waivers, and I started development on the waste discharge requirements for ag in the Scott and Shasta. And then we had to renew the waivers once again so we could extend the timeline. This has been a very long journey, and I really don't like writing permits. It's not the favorite part of my job. So just to talk about the TMDL conditional waivers that have been in place in regulating ag for the past 20 years. Like I said, they were adopted soon after we got the TMDLs in place, and the current version that's operating in the Scott and Shasta was adopted in 2018. These waivers have really encouraged voluntary actions, but also have provided an enforceable backstop for unauthorized discharge. So the way they work is everyone in both watersheds are currently regulated under these waivers. And so when we do get, we observe violations of the waivers, or we get reports of unauthorized discharges or discharges that are outside of the conditions of the waiver, we can then go and take enforcement. We have in several occasions in Scott and Shasta. These waivers were really designed to have an active on-the-ground approach, and we had a staff-driven prioritization approach where we were looking at the highest value habitat areas and what properties that had agriculture were containing those high-value habitat areas, so Coldwater Springs and the Shasta. In the Scott, because shade is really the critical component when it comes to agricultural impacts, we were focused on large landholders with big stream frontages where we could get as many miles of stream frontage assessed as possible. Because this was a waiver and it didn't require enrollment, there were no fees associated with it. So I've been leeching off the rest of the ag program in the state for my paycheck, and this will end with the new WDR. And because of the very focused individual landowner by landowner approach, we had to develop highly tailored monitoring and reporting programs for each landowner that we assessed, which is also a big staff time, very site specific, and a big lift for a lot of ag folks out there to kind of wrap their head around. I'm good at water quality monitoring. Ranchers aren't the best at it. So figuring out how to get common ground there has been a challenge. So we have this waiver program. It's in place. Why are we moving to what's known in the bureaucratic world as General Waste Discharge Requirements? And really the waivers were there to be an introduction to water quality for folks on the ground who are doing agriculture, an introduction to the Regional Water Board and how we work, and a way to sort of build a reputation out there. In our 2018 waiver, we had a finding in it. It's literally finding number 18, where we described the future of the program and we described developing general waste discharge requirements to everyone across both watersheds. Whether they read the permits or not, that's a different story. But generally speaking, we wanted to put it out there that we're looking to build a program that's more like other ag programs across the state of California. Our 2018 waiver was also petitioned, and that petition challenged our compliance with statewide policies that were being precedentially decided at the state board level for the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, and then also other policies like the non-point source policy, anti-degradation, those sorts of things. So we want to make sure that we're in compliance with those statewide precedents moving forward, and also any precedents that have been established since 2018 with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, and building this general waste discharge requirement for ag in the Scott and Shasta is an important part of that. The other thing is we will require enrollment, and I'll go over what we're scoping the enrollment criteria to be, which means we can have more comprehensive implementation of this permit on the ground. It won't be, we're going out to this property owner because they have 15,000 acres in the Scott and 5 to 15 miles of stream frontage. We're saying you're doing ag in the Scott, there's a risk of discharge, so you need to come into the program. So what have I been doing for the past 3 years? Let me tell you. So first in 2023, around the fall, we developed 2 internal teams at the Water Board. A technical team that focused on BMPs that have been used in ag in the past, especially in the Scott and Shasta, looking at the data we've collected, different concepts that we wanted to look at in the TMDL and how this permit could serve those concepts, different monitoring approaches that would be effective and cost effective, things like that. And then we also had the regulatory team, which was really looking at what requirements do we have to meet, do a legal analysis on an ongoing basis as we drafted out the permit, coordinated with the Division of Water Rights, because I don't know if you guys know, but there's emergency regulations that came into play around this time. And then also ensuring that we have an order that's explicitly enforceable if people violate it. So that was fall of 2023 through spring of 2025 to kind of build the foundation of this permit. Then we started our external process, which was to reach out to different interested parties. We did formal tribal consultation and transmitted our correspondences as required by law in December 12th of 2024. We also had some informal face-to-face tribal outreach that we did in January of 2025. And then February 2025, we started our public EIR scoping for CEQA, started our technical advisory group meetings, of which I'll talk about the makeup in a minute, back in February of 2025. Also, a lot happened in February. And then we had some very well-attended and opinionated town halls in Fort Jones and Montague in February of this year. So that's sort of been our outreach approach. We've also been doing a bunch of farm tours over the past irrigation season. So folks who aren't me, who haven't been out on the landscape in the Scott and Shasta and are helping me develop this permit can see what things look like on the ground with different ranches. So our technical advisory group, I tried to make as diverse as possible. So we had ag producers, we had tribes involved, irrigators, the Farm Bureau, Siskiyou County staff, because there is a overlap with the SGMA process that's going on. We invited environmental groups in, different restoration practitioners, technical consultants, including LWA, which works for the county on their SGMA work, but then also has been doing a lot of consulting work for other areas across the state under the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. So they have a lot of experience of what that looks like. And we also had CDFW and the Division of Water Rights join those TAG meetings as well to give input on species concerns and then also water rights issues. So some of the details that have come up from that early work and then the work we've done with outreach and working with the TAG. First, our enrollment criteria, we're likely to have a lower limit on the number of acres that folks need to have to enroll. So commercial agriculture, we're thinking around 50 acres, but we're still dialing in that analysis or more. Or if someone's agricultural property is occurring adjacent to or within the riparian zone, kind of regardless of the size, if they're doing work next to the riparian zone, we want to regulate them. Or if they're doing agricultural work within designated wetlands that we would, in any other case, take jurisdiction over. Also, if they're a member of an irrigation district, this really gets to tailwater, which is a major issue for water quality in the Shasta and a little bit in the Scott, where, if you're part of an irrigation district, you may be part of what's known as like a tailwater neighborhood where multiple landowners are responsible for the ultimate discharge of tailwater to surface water, and we need all of them to work together in a coordinated way. And that's why if folks are a member of an irrigation district, we'd like them to enroll. Or if their method of irrigation results in a discharge to water the state and they're not in an irrigation district, we obviously want them to be part of the program as well. So it's a pretty, sorry, I'm done with my 100% DO calibration. So yeah, that's who's coming into the program as of right now. Trying to cast a wide net or have a big tent for folks to come into the program, I should say. We also have some prohibitions that are built into the permit as of right now. So generally speaking, we don't want to see discharges of tailwater unless they're compliant with what's known as load allocations for the Shasta River TMDL, which includes both the amount of heat that they would introduce to surface water and the amount of nutrients they would introduce into surface water. So we want to make sure that discharges, if they are discharging, are actually improving water quality instead of not improving water quality. And so it will be on the discharger to prove to us that that's the case. And then also, we don't want to see discharges of tailwater if they're outside of the temperature policy in our basin plan, if they're in the Scott. The Scott doesn't have a specific load allocation for temperature in the TMDL or nutrients, but we do have a temperature policy in our basin plan, and we want them to be compliant with that. Also, no riparian grazing conducted without an approved riparian grazing plan. And if you look at the back here, the picture behind this, you can see one set of riparian characteristics on one side of this wetland, and there's a fence down the middle and a bunch of cows on the other side with a different riparian characteristic. And there may be some causal factors there that are causing that. And we would want to make sure that if people are grazing in the riparian area, we have high certainty that it's not going to be impacting riparian vegetation and via discharge of waste. Also, we want to have a prohibition of tillage within 35 feet of the waterside edge of a watercourse. And that's just to provide that minimal riparian buffer. A riparian zone within the definition of our permit is larger than 35 feet, but really we want to prohibit tillage within 35 feet and then have a much larger area considered the riparian zone that's managed in a different way than the rest of agricultural lands. So how do we go about implementing this? Well, we want folks to evaluate their operations according to the conditions in the permit. So the permit will have different conditions for riparian characteristics, for the management and storage of chemicals and fertilizers like petroleum products, those sorts of things, and then how they manage their ag infrastructure and irrigation and how that relates to tailwater discharges. So they would go through, do a farm evaluation, through that farm evaluation, identify water quality threats, and then develop a plan based off of that. And we sort of are looking at these two compliance pathways. One is the proven approach where people are eliminating tailwater discharges. Maybe they're utilizing a well-engineered design that's stamped by a professional engineer that says this will take care of this amount of tailwater, or this will protect this riparian area. Maybe they have full riparian exclusion, but generally speaking, the suite of BMPs they're applying on their property has a high expectation of success. And so there might be more streamlined monitoring approaches for those folks. And then there's like the experimental approach that we're also considering, because we can't foresee everything that'll work. So this approach allows for new techniques. If folks go down this compliance pathway, obviously there's going to be a higher planning scrutiny on our end, because there's more uncertainty around the success of their operations. And so there's going to be a higher bar for monitoring to prove to us that this is actually working. And then to the left there, I've got a reimagining of Clayton. For those of you who know Clayton, is swirly, that describes watershed stewardship, but really it's just adaptive management, where these people are identifying water quality threats. They're developing a management plan or modifying an existing one, applying BMPs based off of that plan, and then monitoring their BMPs for effectiveness. And if they're effective, that's great. If they're not, then they still have a water quality threat, and they've got to continue this process. We will likely have some sort of time schedule that they have to complete this process by. So that will come in our public review draft that will be out in October. So their agricultural water quality management plan will have different modules in it about riparian areas, irrigation, tailwater management. Wherever they identify a water quality threat, they'll need to develop one of these modules to take care of it. We're also thinking about having some in-stream work plan element that provides a water quality certification. If those of you who are familiar with restoration, a 401 permit basically, or 404, that would streamline their ability to put different practices on the ground that they would otherwise need to get a separate permit for, that we know through and have a high degree of confidence will be an improvement to water quality and not a detriment to it. The other element here that's an element in all irrigated lands regulatory programs across the state is the idea of a coalition. And coalitions are an option for enrollees to join. They can always just go it alone if they want to, but coalitions serve to collect fees. They manage communications between their enrollees and the State Water Board and the North Coast Board. They also develop outreach and education materials for their enrollees and implement monitoring and reporting for the large group of enrollees, though we can always require more monitoring if we need it. And so one of the benefits of a coalition is it really reduces the fees that enrollees pay, because it reduces the amount of my staff time that has to go into this. I'm looking at a bunch of folks together as opposed to each individual person, which is kind of how it is under the waiver right now. With the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program at the state level, there's also requirements that we have to deal with for ag. There's requirements around nitrogen budgeting, drinking water well testing, and groundwater monitoring. I'll kind of go through these sequentially. So first, with nitrogen budgeting, the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program requires the nitrogen inputs be reported annually. With irrigated pasture that has no externally applied nitrogen, that's basically not livestock manure, being exempted from that requirement. So it's likely that most of the cattle ranches out there will not need to do nitrogen budgeting, but that doesn't mean that they don't need to account for any discharges of waste that happen into surface waters or groundwaters if there's evidence of that. The other thing that's big in the Scott and Shasta is alfalfa growing. Alfalfa is a nitrogen fixing crop. There's not a lot of nitrogen that's applied, if any. There is the dynamic where if you stop growing alfalfa for a season or two, the alfalfa roots and the sort of the nodules that store the nitrogen for the plant will senesce underground, and there's been shown to be some level of nitrogen loading from that. We haven't seen that in groundwater data so far, but it's something that we're paying attention to and we're aware of. And then drinking water well testing. So wells on enrolled parcels within the permit that are used for drinking water need to be tested for nitrate if that drinking water is supplied to tenants, employees, and farm workers, or any other non-owner user of that drinking water. The owner of that parcel needs to test that drinking water well routinely for nitrogen to make sure that it's below the MCL for nitrogen. And then there's also generally groundwater monitoring. So there's representative groundwater monitoring that needs to be conducted at a watershed or basin scale, generally for nitrate. And the data that's being collected for Sigma could be used to fulfill these requirements if the density is correct and the spatial distribution of sampling points is correct. And so we're working with the county to look at that and see if it's appropriate for this purpose, and also to look at the results. We did a bunch of water quality testing in both watersheds several years ago and found very little nitrogen above the primary MCL, if any. So compared to the problems in the Central Valley, we don't see much nitrogen groundwater, but it's something we do need to keep an eye on and make sure that we're understanding the reality. And so my proposed schedule so far, this is going over the whole last year. So we had a wonderful presentation with the Siskiyou County Board of Supervisors on January 6th. I keep trying to not remember the symbolism of that day in presenting to Siskiyou County. February 2026, we had some town halls like I talked about before. We've been doing farm tours all this spring and summer and are continuing to do them throughout just to make sure we're getting on properties that we haven't seen before. We will release our drafts for public comment of the permit this October and have a adoption hearing for consideration, hopefully in the spring of 2027, if everything goes smoothly, which you never know. We'll see what our board thinks of the public review draft and what kind of comments we get from it. But it's a pretty big project and undertaking that I've been working on so far. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I think I saw some pop up in the chat.
Thank you, Eli. Let's start with questions in the room. All right, let's go to the chat while folks in the room think about this a little more. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, in the process of development, there was back and forth on whether or not some sort of special consideration should be given to people who've kind of gone above and beyond in terms of protecting water quality versus those who have been sort of average or even dragging their feet. I know the Farm Bureau didn't want to give special consideration to people that stepped up like that. Where do you stand currently on that thinking? Are you going that direction, going away from it?
That's a really good question. We're going in that direction just because we know, and I know from experience, that there are folks in both watersheds who have eliminated their discharges of waste. I've seen that on the ground, right? So we want to acknowledge that. But it's going to be a really high bar to hit that level. And essentially they would still have to comply with all the permit conditions, but they may not need to enroll, which means they would avoid fees. But we would need them to provide us with, any permits they filed for restoration, evidence of any plans that we believe are, equivalent to what we would need them to come up with under the permit itself. It's a good, pretty extensive list of things that we're developing right now, and that's going to be something that I hope we get a lot of comment on, because I doubt we're going to get it right the first time, and we need to hear from everybody in terms of what they think. If folks are able to avoid fees and not have to enroll in the program but still be responsible for water quality, what would that look like? What kind of bar would that be? So we'll do our best shot with the draft, but we really want to get comments on that to make sure that we're doing it right.
Really glad to hear it'll be there. Thanks, Eli.
Yeah. And Nick.
Hey, Eli, it's Nick. We've been tracking this pretty closely, as you know, and we've been kind of concerned about the coalition model because following what the county and the Farm Bureau suggests, they want to wrap several different programs into one big coalition. Do you have any indication that this waste discharge permit requirement would be a standalone program, or do you see any inching towards incorporating into other requirements through other agencies or programs?
Yeah, there's nothing in our permit that will include provisions from other programs, right? So our program cannot also count as compliance with the emergency regulations or count as compliance with SGMA provisions whenever they come out. We will put forward what we require from a coalition in the permit, and we will need to approve any organization that steps up to be that coalition. What they do outside of that, if they want to also help landowners with SGMA compliance or with emergency reg compliance or whatever it is, they would be doing that separate from our program. But in order to act as a coalition under our program, they would need to meet the requirements that we have in our permit. So it's kind of like they can do it, but it wouldn't count towards compliance with our program. I don't know if that helps you.
Thanks, that does help.
All right, any other questions in the room?
Hi. Oh, good. I'm not echoing over here. Um, I was wondering, Eli, it's Regina. I was wondering how you're going to deal with the in-stream flow process as part of the TMDLs. I know there was some talk and thoughts about how that there's now that there's, and I know the other Eli hit on this earlier a little bit, but now that the in-stream flows are in the river, it's making it easier to actually meet water quality targets in TMDLs. And so I know that the regional water board can't demand that those flows stay in the river, or at least make sure that it does. But are you going to do an analysis on the Shasta at least, that kind of talks about how the in-stream flow process will be working within the agriculture permit process and how they might work together?
So what I'll say to that is I've been involved in the in-stream flow setting process since 2020. I mean, half of my time was donated to the division during the development of the emergency regulations. So I've been involved in that process for a very long time to really do what I can to inject the TMDLs into that process as much as possible. And I've been successful to varying degrees. I think Dan Schultz is in here, so he's heard me scream about the exact CFS that needs to come out of Big Springs Creek per the TMDL. So that's how we've been approaching that, is to work agency to agency. Generally speaking, that's how we prefer to do it. So you'll notice that we don't necessarily always submit public comment for some of these issues, but we do talk to our sister agencies as peers and try and, work to help inform the science as much as possible. When it comes down to it, though, we do have separate boards. The state board has to make their decisions on this stuff. Our board makes their decisions on our work, and we have very little authority over flow, diversions, water application, except for when it results in a waste discharge. So it's tricky, but we've been coordinating with the state board and CDFW on the emergency regs for, 6 years at this point. Where's the time gone?
All right. Well, Eli, thank you again for presenting on that, and look forward to hearing how this whole process goes.
I see another hand up.
Oh, yeah, we're slightly behind, but go. Yeah, sorry, I didn't see that. Andy. Andy, do you have a question? You can go ahead and unmute.
Hey, how about that? Can you hear me?
You got it.
I got a couple of questions. I really appreciate what you're trying to do. I think your heart's in the right place, but I know that you're up against a real cluster of problems that is beyond anybody's ability to really solve in a very short time, but that need to be addressed sooner than later. But specifically, I'm concerned about two things. One, belly scraping bare minimum flows rather than recovery flows for salmon to become a harvestable surplus so people like me can go back to fishing for them again. It's really a drag. Some of my friends are busting their boats up because they can't afford to keep them in the water any longer because they've had like 3+ seasons with no fish. And Dungeness crab's going to get kicked in the rear this summer with El Nino and the warming ocean. So we need to have flows that make sense, and these don't. And I don't know how long it's going to be before people get their whatever together and make that change. The other thing is about enforcement. On the Smith River, we made extensive comments, Vivian and I, on the effort to minimize pollution from the Lily Bub farm. And there's real clear evidence that wells were poisoned, cancer rates are higher. The buffer strips in their own data say that the buffer strips to keep copper and likely other pollutants out of the river are not working. So when do you go cease and desist, cleanup and abatement, zero discharge limit for an operation like that? They can grow lilies someplace else. Why do we and our fish have to suffer? Most of those fish are qualified for all 5 criteria for listing on the federal ESA, including number 4. So the regulatory framework is proving to be inadequate to protect the safety of the fish, the stock, whatever the species is, and its habitat. So what's next? in this big political, hot, dry summer that we're facing right now. All of the contradictions are coming to the head like a head-on collision. And I don't know where it ends up. And I'm sorry that you're in the middle of it, but you are. So what do you think? Where do we go from here? How do we get there?
Well, so you brought up two topics that one, we don't have authority over, like flow, which I just spoke to. The other is a different program, the lily bulbs. So what I can speak to those are enforcement policy, and we do progressive enforcement, right? So first we issue notice of violations, and then we move up the chain as we need to. We always work from a compliance assistant standpoint first. I don't do any work in the lily bulbs, but I've worked with ranchers in the Scott where I have issued NOVs, and they've resulted in people coming into compliance before we had to do a cleanup and abatement order or a cease and desist or any of those administrative liabilities. So it really becomes a site-specific thing in terms of how we move forward in enforcement. So enforcement is a stepwise process, and it's a progressive process. And we always like to get folks into compliance without having to use those tools, because a lot of those tools go before our board, and it's our board's decision to file some of these orders. So I just want to put that out there, especially when it comes to administrative liabilities and fines. In terms of flows, we have a flow recommendation in the Shasta TMDL. It's very clear. It's about flows from Big Springs and what we need from what cold water we need out of Big Springs. And we've been continuing to push that issue with the state board during their process. And then, with the Scott, we are very focused on the dynamics between groundwater and surface water, because we believe that that's what prolonged summertime base flow, that's what develops cold water refugia outside of areas where you have it in the tributaries. And, that's the whole reason why the Scott Valley Integrated Hydrologic Model exists in the Scott, is because we pushed that issue hard enough. We made sure that the county bought into it as a party to the TMDL, and then we funded the work to develop that model. And, work continues to go on that's informed by that model and other models that hook into it. So those are the tools we have to deal with these sorts of things. I'm going to defer from speaking about lily bulbs because it's just not my area of expertise. But there's other folks on our staff, and I'm sure you wrote comments, so you know who they are, that you can speak to about that in particular.
What about minimum flows for fish? What about that? What do you think? How can we make that happen?
That's within the domain of the state board. They regulate water diversions and water rights, and specifically, ensuring that the right water is in the river at the right time. And from a water quality standpoint and a temperature standpoint is probably the most important aspect of that.
All right.
Well, it's about as good as answer I can expect at this point. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Eli. I really appreciate that presentation. And to the folks asking good questions in the audience, thank you again.